Hey friends, it's Jed. Most of you know me as the assistant editor / announcer guy for React Native Radio. But today, I'm coming to you as director of operations. That's my day job here at Infinite Red. We're dropping a quick message to all of our listeners to say, we're hiring. Now, I get to work with some amazing developers here. But the problem right now is Jamon keeps sending me projects and I'm running out of developers to put on them. I've tried cloning Mazen. It didn't work out well, so now we're here. Infinite Red is looking for senior React Native developers in the US. And if that's you, take advantage of this rare opportunity and head over to careers.infinite.red to apply. Thanks for listening. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Welcome back to another episode of the React Native Radio Podcast. Episode 334, React Native macOS with Saad Najmi.
Mazen and Robin, when did you first use like a Macintosh computer, a Mac of some sort? A lot of people didn't grow up with Macs. Actually, did you?
Well, I actually did grow up with Macs.
Okay, I was going to ask, Robin, you seem like the type that would have grown up with a Mac.
I mean, my brother, who was one of the co-founders of Infinite Red, was a computer nerd from the 80s. And so my family always had Macintoshes growing up, including a PowerPC, which is it was like the family computer that I used in middle school. But then I moved to Windows for a very brief period of my life because I got my own computer like in my room. Like I got a hand-me-down laptop for my brother or something. And then my dad bought me an old used Windows 98 computer. And that was like the computer I used in high school. It was like I did AOL instant messaging and like all that stuff on Windows. So like there was this period of time where I was a Windows user, and then I got a MacBook for college. And then I was back as a Mac user until I went to the corporate world and then had to use Windows for a while. But now I'm Mac always, all the time.
When you worked for Dunder Mifflin, right?
When I worked for Dunder Mifflin, the paper company, I had to use Windows, unfortunately.
Robin used to work for a paper company.
Did.
Yeah.
I did work for a paper company, yeah.
That's pretty funny. How about you, Mazen?
So growing up, all throughout, childhood, it was all Windows PCs up until, actually, when I was 12, I worked at my cousin's computer shop where we built custom PCs for people. And that was like how I kind of got into computers. But when I got to college, I built a custom Dell and kind of went through the website, got it all set up, and I was Windows through and through up until 2009. So like junior year, right before finals, I was mad at I don't know what or who. So I threw my bag across the room, only to realize my laptop was in it. Shattered my screen.
Oh no.
Ran to the bookstore. They only had a Mac. I was like, oh no. Sure, I guess I'll figure out how to use this. I need to write this paper.
Now, what era was this of Macs?
I don't even remember. It was the
2009?
It was 2009.
That would have been like the big MacBook Pros.
It was a huge one. Yeah. It actually, I had to get like a whole new sleeve. It didn't fit in like the compartment for my bag.
Square.
It was heavy. It was heavier than my Windows machine. And I got like the extended battery pack on my Windows, that Dell PC. Oddly enough, the bag kind of just made it into my office. I have that PC sitting right next to me right now.
Oh, that's funny.
The one with the shattered screen. So anyways, after all that, I plug in the PC into my roommate's TV, finish out my paper, put it on a thumb drive, and then put it on this new Mac so I can take it to class and continue my paper and all that. So 2009 is when I got into Windows. After I transferred that file over. Into Mac. Once I transferred that thumb drive paper over to my Mac, I have not used the PC. And every time I see my brother's PC, I don't know how he uses it.
I know. I cry a little bit when I have to use my husband's computer because he's a gamer and also works in the corporate world. So he pretty much only uses Windows.
I do miss the crazy sounds it used to make on booting.
I know. We're sitting here. Yeah. Spoiler alert, we're sitting here talking to someone who works at Microsoft. So
I know, that's the thing. Like, let's be a little bit nice. But the funny thing is, Saad, I know that you use a Mac there, which is hilarious. So
yes.
Tell me your first Mac story.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure my first Mac was actually at Microsoft.
That is irony of the highest degree.
That's funny. So you used Windows before that?
Yeah, because like I don't know. I feel like if you're like in high school or in college, you just get the cheapest bang for buck computer, which was usually not a MacBook. Also,
Right.
like I'm pretty sure I messed around with like installing Arch Linux and all that stuff on my computer.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was one semester where we had like 10 projects, and every project I switched from Windows to Linux, and I don't know how I like lived that semester. But yeah, like my first memory of using a Mac, I think, was actually my Microsoft internship. And not the first one, but the second one where I ended up on the team that I'm at now. And I'm like, oh, okay, we only do Apple development here. This is interesting.
Not what
And
I expected.
People don't realize this, but Microsoft has always been the biggest Mac developer outside of Apple, like by far. It's not even close.
I didn't realize we were the
Like
biggest.
for software. What's that?
I knew we were big, like definitely like top 5. I didn't realize we were the biggest, but I totally believe that.
I'm pretty sure you're the biggest like software developer for Mac. That as far as like users, right? Like people
that's true.
using your software. There's tons of people.
The Office
yeah,
products will do
Office,
that.
and there was Skype and all this other stuff. So yeah, I think that it's kind of funny because I mean all along, you know, there's sort of like this Apple versus Microsoft thing, but I mean Microsoft makes software for lots of different operating systems. So yeah.
I think the Apple versus Microsoft thing, that might be true for like operating systems, but Office runs everywhere and we want it to run everywhere. So it has to be on everything. And so like, I do not feel the Apple versus Microsoft at all in like my org and my position in what I do.
Yeah.
We work with
It's
Apple a lot.
It's not like Nike versus Adidas, where if you're caught wearing Adidas clothes at the Nike headquarters, like they ask you to leave
It's a real
immediately.
Yeah. Yeah. So I of course use like, I'm old enough that we used Apple IIs in our computer lab in like elementary school. We even had a Macintosh there. I mean, I think in 5th grade we got a Macintosh that was like a black and white thing. All I remember is playing a couple games on it, and but it had the the graphical user interface. Using a mouse, which I thought was ridiculous. Like, why wouldn't you just use a keyboard? And
You still think that?
Mostly, actually, I'm I'm backsliding. Weirdly, I actually have 2 mice now. I have a trackpad and a mouse. That
Same.
I use
I've got a trackpad on the left and a mouse.
Well,
on
I
the
got it
right.
from your brother. He told me to do that.
I got
and
it
tried
from my
and I was
brother,
like,
too.
Okay.
The trackpad is
Thanks a lot,
magic.
Ken.
I don't blame you.
Yeah.
Wait,
It is really good.
trackpad and a mouse?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a trackpad for trackpaddy things, and then I have a mouse for mouse things. Yeah, because the gestures on macOS are so useful.
Mm-hmm.
It's
It's
I
also
only
like
use the trackpad full time.
Yeah. I mean, that works too.
I did that for a while, I'm pretty sure, until I bought a gaming mouse and realized how good this is. But like,
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the ergonomics prevent me from using the trackpad for everything because like I'll get hand crampy if I'm trying to do a lot of
me too.
micro stuff.
But I used Windows computers for the most part. Well, DOS, then Windows, and just kind of like followed that along until one of my employees, Daniel Berkumpus, actually was like, hey, we should be using Macs. They're really good for, web development and things like that. And I'm like, really? And what sold me was he was like, yeah, they have like basically like a BSD like core. And I didn't realize that. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like that's closer to our servers, which are Linux, as like a closer thing. And so I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then I bought like this Craigslist MacBook Pro, and then it died like 2 weeks later. It had the problem where like the GPUs, it was like a 2008 or 09, where the GPUs would unseat because of the heat, and you could actually put the motherboard, or what do they call it? The logic board in the oven for like 15 minutes, and it would reseat it, and it worked. I did that, and it worked for like
Wait,
what
like the
temperature?
actual like
When
the
did you
oven
turn
in
on?
your house?
it was like 375 for like 10 minutes or something, and it would just reset it. And I did that like twice, and then eventually I got really tired of it. I actually brought it into an Apple store, and I was like, hey, this thing, is doing this thing. And they're
take it
like,
to the
well,
break room in the back and pop it in
Have
the
you
oven.
been cooking it?
the reverse
They're
Xbox
like-
Red Ring of Death.
right, yeah. So they were like, no, this MacBook has a lot of issues. It has water damage. It has this, has that. It's like too old for us to do anything. But they like treated me so well compared to any PC manufacturer I'd ever used. that I was like, okay, this is the company I want to go with. And I bought a brand new, MacBook Air, I think, and haven't looked back. I actually do use Windows for gaming stuff. I use Mac, of course, for work. And like you said, Saad, and I do want to bring this back to our episode here. Microsoft
we
wants to
actually
run
are
things.
doing a podcast here.
Yeah, we are doing a podcast. But I think that our podcast is probably going to be a little bit like this. But it's Microsoft wants to run it everywhere. And of course, what's better for that than React Native? But before we get into that, I do want to say this episode is sponsored by Infinite Red. Our company, Infinite Red, is a premier React Native consultancy. We're located in the US. We have about 30 people here, all senior level React Native developers and a few support staff. We've been doing this for just about 10 years. So go to infinite.red/radio. And don't forget to mention that you heard about us through the React Native Radio podcast. Saad, can you introduce yourself? What's your background and how did you land at Microsoft?
My name is Saad Najmi. I'm a software engineer at Microsoft. How did I get to Microsoft? I interviewed in college career fair, and I had 2 internships with them, the second of which was for the Office on Apple team. And so I just kind of came back to that team. So I started out doing native macOS development for my team. If you've ever used Microsoft Auto Update, which is this little app that updates your Office apps, the UI for that was one of my first main projects. That was before we were on the App Store. So now you can just download Office from the App Store.
Right.
But yeah, so eventually at some point I realized that part of my team was working on React Native. And I'm like, wait, what? How? And then they told me, yeah, we forked it for macOS. I'm like, what? Really? And so that sounded pretty cool. Reorg later, I ended up on a team that was doing open source UI frameworks for Office, which was what came out of that is Fluent UI Apple and Fluent UI React Native. Fluent UI Apple is mostly iOS controls, a mix of UIKit and Swift UI. And then Fluent UI React Native is a bunch of React Native controls, mostly for Windows and Mac. So before I did actual React Native Mac development, I was using React Native Mac to write UI. And I think that's important because you'll meet people who work on a platform but have never used said platform to ship features.
Actually build an app.
Yeah. So I'm pretty happy that I had that experience first. But as I got more and more into it, I was like, wait, I kind of just want to make things better in React Native Mac and not I feel like there's a lot of opportunity here to make this library a lot more interesting. And so just as time went on, I kind of got more and more into that space. And so a couple of reorgs later, I'm one of the people who is the maintainers for React Native macOS. We're all very collaborative. We work with a lot of the React Native Windows people. And yeah, so my full-time job is now working on React Native Mac, which is interesting. Not what I thought I'd be doing at Microsoft when I joined, but
yeah.
I can't be happier.
Yeah, a lot of people get they're just a little bit surprised that Microsoft maintains that, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, Microsoft relies very heavily on it. So my first question is, and I did a little poking around and also chatted with you a little bit about this, but I really want to know how React Native macOS works, because if you're looking at the source, you actually see a lot of UIKit APIs, and the macOS version of that is actually AppKit, and you should be seeing NS instead of UI everywhere. And NS, of course, just a little tidbit, stands for next step. It goes all the way back to Steve Jobs' Next company way back in the 90s. And but they folded that in when they made OS 10, and which became macOS. And but UIKit was forked from that and is supposed to be for iOS. So how are you able to use UIKit APIs in a Mac app?
Yeah, so the short answer is a lot of if-defs, and then I'll explain why we went that way. So as you said, AppKit is the older brother of UIKit. UIKit is the iOS framework that all of React Native iOS is built off of, and a lot most iOS apps are built off of. I don't know if it's most anymore. Now they have Swift UI, which is their new thing. But so UIKit takes a lot of its cues off of AppKit, and it's kind of where Apple learned how to do things better. So they'd have an API for, I don't know, making images. And they're like, this one thing was kind of not very ergonomic. So when they did it for iOS, they simplified the API or they like added a feature. So the code looks very similar, but you still have NS image instead of UI image. And there are subtle differences. So and this is before my time, I came into React Native macOS kind of after it was published and matured. So the decision to use ifdefs was kind of already done.
Can you explain what an ifdef is and what you mean by that?
Yeah. Okay. So ifdef, compiler looks at your code, turns it into binary. But before the compiler turns it into code, you can do, what are they called? Precompiler macros?
Yeah.
So you can do like if...
Or a compiler directive, I guess, is another. Yeah.
So you can do pound if target is iOS, let image equal UI image. Pound else, let UI image equal NS image. Or you can say pound define UI image, NS image, and then everywhere where you have the text UI image, it'll replace it with NS image when compiling for Mac.
Yeah, it's like a polyfill. That's how a JavaScript developer would think about it in some ways, right?
I guess so. So since I started off as a native developer, I forget like some of the JavaScript words are like, yeah, I guess that is a polyfill. I've never thought about it that way. I've always viewed it as text replacement because it's literally just like changing the text the compiler sees before it like compiles your code.
Yeah, like by the time it actually gets to the compiler part of it, it's not a UI image anymore. It's an NS image. But in your code, you can write UI image. And the benefit to that is you can have the same code for iOS and Mac, right? Generally.
Mostly the same code. Like if the like initializer for UI image takes 3 arguments, the initializer for NS image takes 4, you still got to kind of work around that. And maybe like make a helper function, and then the helper function has an ifdef inside of it that calls one or the other based on the platform.
Yeah.
It would be great if these were not ifdefs and these were all like not involving replacing text for the compiler, but as like
Why is that? I'm really curious. Why would it be better to not have the ifdefs?
Okay. I kind of just feel like ifdefs are a little dirty. Like they feel like an old thing. They don't feel like a very like new modern way of doing things, but
Are they like particularly brittle?
I think if you have a lot of them, yeah.
Yeah.
Probably hard to follow the logic a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes, it gets muddied in that sense, and you're not exactly sure. Like you can't really follow it.
Yeah, like it's if you have one method, but then like three ifdefs inside of there, you just kind of have to like in your head like block out. Okay, if it's iOS, I ignore these parts of the code. If it's macOS, I ignore these parts of the code. And like indentation levels are kind of weird because you don't actually have to keep those consistent.
Yeah, it makes the source just look a little weird. Sorry, Saad, I have to stay on this for just a second because I know there are a lot of people who listen to this podcast who have never once written any native code.
That is
it's
wild
just
to me.
JavaScript. Yeah. And just so that they can kind of understand what happens in JavaScript, especially with Metro and React Native, here's a semi like analog to what we're talking about. There is if __ dev __.
Yeah.
And so that right there is like if you're bundling for development versus if you're bundling for production, what Metro will actually do is actually delete all the code that's inside of the if dev block. And that means that you can put a bunch of code in there that would break or maybe just be like slow if you're running in production that you don't want to run in production, but you need it for development. So not exactly the same thing, but in some ways it's similar because it's basically stripping all that stuff out before it compiles it into a bundle.
And very similarly, like we say this a lot, we're spoiled in the React Native sense. Like what Saad just described is on the native layer. But before we even get there, we have file extensions. So .web, .native, Metro strips those out before we even get down. That's another guard per se, where you can say like, hey, guard against, for example, I just did it on a project where we have web and native, but we know our API breaks on web just because of the backend contract. So we have a, .web quote unquote polyfill that handles our fetch error going to web so that we can fix those network requests going through the web client. And that's just another way of guarding it on a higher level. And kind of like what you said, Saad, this is a cleaner way of doing it because, the files are restricted. It's easier to read and understand what's happening versus when you get down to the native layer, You just so many if else or if defs kind of muddied all around that aren't tabbed. And I think we talk about all these tabs. We fight about tabs, but when you get down to native and you don't have to worry about it, it changes the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think like if you write code like in Swift, they actually are a little bit better about the if defs, where now they're actually in line and they do a little bit more type checking. But like we did the if defs because we want to be as close as possible to iOS. React Native exists in, Facebook's repo. There's lots and lots of iOS engineers who will keep on writing iOS code. And what's the best way to make sure that any new thing, like new feature or bug fix that shows up in iOS code also shows up in macOS? If we just wrote completely different files, like let's say we forked the image component, which is RCT image. Cool, that fork lives in our repo. Fast forward 3 versions, iOS adds 10 new props to image. We might not see that because when we do our git merge, we had a different file. We don't really see what's happening in iOS. The if defs kind of mean that if the code gets updated, well, now you have a merge conflict, which is painful, but that's also...
Right, it's painful, but it draws your attention.
Yeah.
Yeah, it forces you to... Yeah.
It forces me to see all the changes that affect code that we might be around. And then in the merge, we have to be like, okay, so they added this new prop accessibility language. Okay, is that also on macOS? Oh, it is. Okay, so we can add an if-def over here and then implement that. Or, oh, hey, this code actually just kind of works because the letters in the code happen to be the same. Great. Thank you, Apple. So it makes things slower, but it does force us to be as close to React Native on iOS as possible, which I think is a better benefit. So that's kind of why we went with if-defs. It was the best solution to our problem. There's other ways we could have done this. And Fabric makes it easier because a lot of code just moves to cross-platform C++, so there's less if-defs to deal with. But yeah, that's how we use UIKit on macOS, by faking it with if-defs.
Kind of feel like the React Native core could make your life a little easier by adding the if-defs and just having like a placeholder for the Mac stuff. Like where you have if-defs. The problem is there's a coordination problem there, like making sure that everything is, like as you make changes, then they'd have to make changes that don't even affect them. So yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, so that's this is a problem that has been talked about for many years of, wouldn't it be nice if React Native was just React Native and Android and iOS were actually separate packages, and then you just have this core that every platform implements? And I think actually with Fabric, we're quite close to that because much of the code has actually moved to the cross-platform C++ shadow node layer that I'm learning more and more about all the time. I thought I knew a lot about Fabric. I went to a conference in Paris, and then there were a couple of talks about Fabric, and I'm like, wow, I don't know any of that happened. So that was pretty cool. So yeah, if React Native macOS was owned by Facebook and in Facebook, we wouldn't have the coordination problem. But because we're a separate company with our own release schedule, and we're not every commit that goes into React Native, it might take a month or two for us to get it to us. The coordination problem is really just that's why we can't do that. Windows kind of has the same problem. They don't have the benefit of forking all the iOS code. They just have to go re-implement everything themselves. So I think out of 3 platforms, we'll just kind of have to always do it somewhat separately. Fabric does make it better, but yeah, it's ultimately a coordination problem.
When looking at the docs, I noticed that a bunch of props that we would see at the React Native.dev docs within the API of different components and whatnot are missing. And you kind of touched on that, where it's probably because it's not available on Mac OS yet, and you all are just trying to make sure to pipe it. I guess my main question here is your objective at the end of the day to come to full API parity with iOS and Android for React Native? Or is that not a feasible goal at the end of the day?
So this is where I think Windows has recently done a better job than us, which is actually documenting which props work and don't work. The goal is to be as close to iOS as possible, which by extension means being as close to Android as possible. I don't think we ever actually went and documented which props work and which ones don't, outside of the TypeScript types. So if somebody asks me, does this thing work on React Native macOS? I usually just say, if it works on iOS, then it should. And if it doesn't, that's a bug. Please open an issue and I'll look into it.
That's good to know.
Yeah, there are some iOS specific things that we probably don't want on React Native macOS. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but like pull to refresh for scroll view. There is no pull to refresh for scroll views on desktop. That's mostly a mobile only thing. So everywhere there's like a set the pull to refresh view components, I just if-def that out because there is nothing for me to do there.
Totally makes sense. And even something like, I don't think we really think about this much, but when you're looking at a Mac OS specific app, there's not navigation per se. You're not navigating, swiping in and out screens. You might have like the side tab, but all that side tab is just probably mounting a new view per se on the right hand panel, because it's not really a navigation stack is what I'm trying to get at. So
yeah,
understanding the differences in OSs is also very important to that point.
It's actually really interesting that you brought that up because I try to keep tabs on what are the big libraries that most people use. React Navigation and React Native Screens are obviously one of them. I've looked into whether we should port React Native Screens to macOS or if that's already being done. I went and opened an issue and talked to the people who maintain React Native Screens. And I think they basically said, yeah, we looked into it, but there isn't really a navigation stack on macOS, so there's not really anything for us to port. So we can maybe make like a minimal JS version where you don't need to write native code and you get your stack. But yeah, React Native Screens specifically is one where we thought about porting it to macOS and ultimately decided not to because it doesn't really make sense, which still kind of confuses me. But yeah, that's desktop versus mobile.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of like libraries and their compatibility with macOS, I mean, like people talk about like the third-party library support for macOS lags pretty significantly behind, obviously, the main tree platforms, iOS and Android, but also like React Native Windows, just looking at the directory, has like 60 packages that have support for it, and tvOS has 80. And then like macOS has like 33 or something like that. What's behind that? Is it an actual technical hurdle that it's harder to make these packages compatible? Is it, like you said, just like platform differences, like things that just don't apply to macOS? Or is it just a demand issue? Like there's not people demanding these features for macOS.
So the first thing I thought of when you said that was I should probably go through the directory and
see if there's any more that need to just have the metadata updated.
Yeah, because I would think that it's easier to add macOS support to a library than Windows support. So if there are actually more,
I would think that too, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm gonna have to go look into that. That's kind of a surprise to me. I thought it'd be like the other way around.
But like you said, it could just be a metadata issue because it's all like open source. Like
yeah,
I think
library authors update their own stuff. So
yeah, last I checked, the React Native directory is like a giant JSON file, which was interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But okay, so to add macOS support to your library, if it's just a JS library, you probably don't need to do anything. If you've got native code, then you basically have to do three things. One, update your pod spec to have macOS as one of the platforms. Two, go and update your code with ifdefs or add a separate Mac implementation. And then three, go add a test app to your library so that you can test your library in macOS. We have the library React Native Test App for doing that. I super love that library because it does kind of the whole continuous native generation thing for you so that you don't have to know how to make a macOS test app. You just have to add a pod file and it generates the Mac test app for you. So I've gone and updated a couple of libraries to have both Mac and visionOS support because there's a whole era where we had to go get visionOS working. But the process is actually not too bad. Like, I would think that ifdefs would be annoying and pretty hard, but there's a couple of libraries that went and added macOS support themselves. Namely, there's Reanimated, there's React Native SVG. We actually did that. And
yeah,
I think
WebView.
WebView is
I don't remember if we did WebView or if it was already there, but most of that code is also just cross-platform, so it's fine.
Mm-hmm.
I would have thought that more people would complain about, I need to maintain all this macOS code, but that's actually not the complaint that I've seen. The complaint has been more, hey, macOS is one version behind, so I can't update the library. And so, the thing that I've taken from that is to keep community libraries happy is I need to make sure that React Native Mac is more up to date. But the process of adding macOS supports was actually not that bad.
So there's probably a lot of libraries out there that don't support it that could very easily support it, or maybe already support it and they just don't know because they've never tried.
And I think it's mostly a demand thing. Like if somebody wants to use a library and they find one, but it's only on iOS, if they file an issue on React Native macOS, I'll go tell them to file an issue on the actual library, but it's also good for me to know, hey, this is a library you want, so that I know which libraries people are using. So maybe do both. I'm not really sure.
Yeah. It's unfortunately a bit of a chicken and egg thing that starts to happen. People are like, oh, well, there's not enough libraries supporting macOS. I was like, well, if more people were using macOS, there'd be more reason for these library authors to add support for it.
Yeah, but I think like a lot of the big ones are there. Like we have Gesture Handler, we have Reanimated, Ski and WebGPU both got macOS support recently.
Right. Looking through the list of macOS ones are they're very much like the core packages that
the big ones
that you think of when you do React Native development, which is awesome. It's the other like 1,300 random libraries that you probably don't need, and even if you do, it probably wouldn't actually be that hard to add macOS support if you did need them.
If there's a library that people want macOS support for, even if I don't have the bandwidth to go implement it, I'd love to know what those are. So I guess just like go tell me on GitHub or Twitter or whatever. Should I be soliciting for lots of Twitter DM requests? Maybe not. I don't know.
Probably
Here, how about
issue.
this? How about this?
Yeah.
You all tell us.
We can
tell
convey.
us in our community Slack or on Twitter, and we'll triage and we'll tell Saad.
So a couple years ago, I started to build this Mac app, and I actually just ran with like Mac Catalyst, which Mac Catalyst is where you literally build it for iOS, and then the operating system actually has this compatibility layer of Mac Catalyst. And experience was pretty good, actually. I felt like it actually went pretty well. Have you played around with Catalyst? Do you see sort of like what are the trade-offs there?
Yeah, so Catalyst is super interesting. I think before talking about like React Native with Mac Catalyst, I'll just talk about Mac Catalyst in general. So UIKit and AppKit are different. Most people are using UIKit. Apple is like, how do we get more iOS developers to make Mac apps? So they made SwiftUI, which is their new thing that works on both. But they also went and made this thing called Mac Catalyst, which is effectively a new platform in the eyes of Xcode, I guess. But is basically just take your iOS app, all of its code, and you can compile it for macOS, and then you have a Mac app. I think the way they pitch it is bring your iPad app to desktop, because iPad is at least closer to like the screen resolution and everything. If you go and use some of the system tools like dyld_info, you can kind of figure out if a system app is Mac Catalyst or macOS. And to my surprise, a bunch of the system apps are actually Mac Catalyst. Like the Messages app is Mac Catalyst.
Really?
Yeah. And that really surprised me, because I was like, oh, maybe this is just like a thing for developers to not need to write two apps, but Apple doesn't use it. But no, they use it too.
They use it. Wow.
Yeah. So like every person who has a MacBook is probably using a Mac Catalyst app at some point.
Are there performance like implications or?
So I haven't played around much with Mac Catalyst for one big reason, which is your entire app has to be Mac Catalyst. And we mostly use React Native Mac in our big existing Mac app that is
like a brownfield. Yeah, that makes sense.
So like one, React Native Mac predates Mac Catalyst, but two, even if it didn't, we'd still have to make React Native Mac, because we're not rewriting all of Office in Mac Catalyst. We're taking the Mac app, we're adding a task pane or a floating window and putting React Native in there. And you just can't do that with Catalyst. There's no way to like embed a Catalyst instance inside your Mac app.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So that's kind of the trade-off. Like if you start from scratch, it's a viable solution. And there may be, I don't know, I didn't get very far with that Mac app, so I don't know what all of the, the trade-offs there are right there. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It's also how much you care about, like, if you don't want to write any code to take your iPad app to Mac and just like have it work, it works. They all feel a bit like DPI, like the DPI just feels a little bit off. And I don't like, this is weird because the macOS system apps feel great, but then I'll download, like, I have a calorie tracking app that is also on Mac Catalyst, and I'll look at it, I'm like, yeah, this just feels a little bit off. I'm not really sure what it is, but I don't care because now I can do a thing on my Mac that I couldn't do otherwise.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah, there are a couple of Mac Catalyst apps I use that are fine, and then there's at least one React Native Mac Catalyst app that I downloaded to see, oh, how does this feel, and it felt fine. It was interesting. So I think they're both options. It's kind of just, do you want to be more desktop focused, or do you want to just take your app that you already wrote and add a new platform for not much effort?
Yeah, awesome. I think we're kind of getting towards the end of the episode, but I kind of want to ask you a last question as we're wrapping up here. In your opinion, what do you think React Native macOS does well that people might not know about? Or just, what does it do well in general? And, conversely, like, what sucks about React Native macOS, and like, how could it could improve in?
I think what React Native macOS does well with is we're actually pretty good with keeping up with the community. We pay attention to what's happening in iOS. We make sure that most of the new features with like Metro or Permies or all that do work on macOS. As we talked about a little bit earlier, we're really good at the brownfield approach. If you just want to have part of your app be React Native, you can do that. And then if you've got a cross-platform like Mac and Windows app, you can do the same thing with React Native Windows. And we've added hooks to Metro so that if you have React Native macOS and you have import React Native and you're on a .macOS file, it knows to replace that with import React Native macOS. We have hooks to TypeScript to make sure that TypeScript type checks against the macOS types instead of the React Native types. There's a lot of implementation with the rest of the React Native community that we've had to go solve, and that has just worked pretty well. And when I've talked to people who do use React Native macOS and ask them hey, did you have problems with the library? Did you have, what was missing for you? They usually say, oh no, the React Native Mac part actually just worked fine. Most of the things I wanted to do from React Native just worked. So
That's awesome.
that makes me happy because I'm always worried, I just forgot about this entire component or prop or whatever. The part that I think we don't do well, it's kind of like community templates or marketing or starter guides.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I was going to say this if you didn't. Sorry, Saad.
Hey, we'll work with you. We can have Ignite for macOS.
Yeah, I know.
So I'm on the Office team. Office is the one that funds and develops React Native macOS because we want to use it for Office. Mm-hmm. That's different from React Native Windows, where the React Native Windows org is in the Windows org and they want you to go write Windows apps. Office doesn't care if you write macOS apps. We want React Native Mac so we can make Office better. So kind of
that makes sense.
The goal is to make development for our app better, which means that we might not invest as much in the making your first greenfield app, from scratch app better.
Yeah.
You can kind of notice that in the docs. I'm working on new docs. I'll have that out soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And that's where I would love to see what people want and what we can help with. Mm-hmm. I can't always do everything, but I try to at least direct people. If there's some guy who really wants to do React Native Mac stuff or really wants to do React Native Windows stuff, but doesn't know who to talk to or doesn't know where to start, I'm always willing to go and kind of help point them in the right direction. And also, I've been super happy that Jamon's been interested recently. He's been giving me lots of good pointers as well, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. We have also Frank Calise on our team who's been pushing. He's a little bit more on the Windows side, but he is very interested in both. And like Robin alluded to there, we have some internal interest in building an Ignite desktop version, which would essentially really smooth out all that stuff, because that's what we did in the very beginning with React Native itself, when it was even more
when it was
rough.
not smooth.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was terrible. And we used Ignite as you just start here. With our experience, we smooth out all of the bumps, and then you just get to build stuff.
Obviously, React Native itself, along with Expo and everything, have made the default experience a lot smoother, but we still love Ignite for many, many reasons.
I just want to point one thing. Kira Mooney posted an article I want to say even less than a week ago,
From the Microsoft desktop team. Yep.
It was like 3 days ago or something.
Yeah. Well, 3 days ago from the recording, May 9th, but it's how Office is modernizing their app suites UI using Windows App SDK and React Native. I think it's a short article with, I posted it in the show notes. Everyone should be able to take a look at it. It's a good read if you want to learn more about the Windows SDK and how React Native helps it, and also get to show that, React Native isn't an app that you're using, day to day.
Yeah. And the thing I want to point out right as we kind of close this down is the big question that we haven't talked about at all is why no Expo support? And I think that while that would be awesome, it does, like, it's a bigger job than you think. Expo has done a ton of work for React Native, iOS, and Android, and it's a significant investment for them to go make sure that macOS and Windows both work. And maybe the macOS side wouldn't be so difficult, I don't know, but for sure the Windows side is a tremendous undertaking, and you kind of need to do both. So for right now, if you want to build an Expo like Mac app, you should use Mac Catalyst. That's actually what I did. I used Expo on Mac Catalyst and was able to build my app that way. There are some trade-offs there. It's actually less native than what Saad's team is working on, but you can get a Mac app up. So cool. Well, we got to wrap it up. I think thanks so much, Saad. I know there's way more we could talk about because you and I have had tons of conversations at various conferences and just online and whatnot about all this stuff. There's so much more, but we're already way long, so got to wrap it up. Thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Well, we will see you all next time.
Bye.
As always, thanks to our editor, Todd Worth, our assistant editor, Jed Bartosky, our marketing and episode release coordinator, Justin Husky, and our guest coordinator, Mazen Chami. Our producers and hosts are Jamon Holmgren, Robin Hines, and Mazen Chami. Thanks to our sponsor, Infinite Red. Check us out at infinite.red/radio. A special thanks to all of you listening today. Make sure to subscribe to React Native Radio on all the major podcasting platforms.